we have a panel of experts here and in the audience to reflect on the year that has passed and the year that is to come. A year where certainly the foreign news agenda has been very much swayed by the Arab Spring, as it was called, which has arguably made it much harder for other situations and other parts of the world to make it into the news. And this is an opportunity for us to talk about some of those other situations which may have fallen off the map, if you like. I should warn you, the event is being filmed and streamed live on the internet. But at the same time, I would encourage you to be as frank as you possibly can. If that isn't a contradiction in terms. I know there are lots of people who know an awful amount in the audience, but there are also some here who don't know very much, including myself. And we should therefore keep it relatively simple for the benefit of everybody. This isn't an opportunity for big speeches. I hope it's an opportunity for a conversation where people should feel free to chip in their views as often as they can. I thought we should start quite simply. I should introduce you, first of all. On my right, Sara Pantuliano, who is head of the Humanitarian Policy Group at the Overseas Development Institute. Before joining the ODI, she was head of the peace-building unit at the UNDP. She's an expert on Sudan, has written extensively on Sudan, which might qualify as one of those situations we don't report often enough these days. And she's also the editor of the snappily titled Disasters magazine. Journal, I should say, sorry. On my left here, Dennis McNamara, humanitarian advisor at the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, which from what I can gather covers a multitude of sins, including interesting negotiations with all sorts of people, some of which I hope you can talk about, some of which you probably can't. Sure. The phrase non-state actors would cover a lot of those people, I would suspect. Huge experience at the UNHCR and the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, posts as UNHCR Special Envoy in the former Yugoslavia and Iraq. Very interested to hear your thoughts on military intervention this year in the light of Kosovo and other experiences that you must have had. On my far left, Leslie Norton, Director General of the Canadian International Development Agency's International Humanitarian Assistance Directorate. Has been with the Canadian government since 1998, has worked for the Foreign Ministry and with Canada's permanent mission to the UN in Geneva. And finally, on my right here, Manuel Aranda da Silva is from Mozambique. He's now Senior Advisor for Policy, Planning and Strategy for the world's biggest humanitarian organisation, the World Food Programme. Other posts have included Humanitarian Coordinator for the Horn of Africa, which I'm sure we'll be talking about this evening,
10 years ago.
and Sudan. Just to start with, it'd be useful to know from each of you really, what, if you had to choose a couple of events this year which you judge to have been the main events in the world in which you work, what would those be? Can I start with you on the left here? We'll go left to right.
Sure. I'll start with the obvious if I can. Obviously, the drought in East Africa has probably been one of the larger events for the humanitarian community. Also, obviously, Libya. I'm going to be stating the obvious here. Southern Sudan getting its independence was very exciting for us all, only to see now that fighting continues along the border. I will speak also from our regional perspective. I think Haiti, we continue to focus in on Haiti in the post-recovery phase, but I think cholera continues to be very prominent there, and we're, I think, looking forward, thinking, seeing that the numbers are going to be huge for cholera in Haiti again this year. Perhaps I'll leave it there, or else my colleagues will have.
So we've heard the Horn of Africa, Sudan, Libya, Haiti. What would you reflect on the events which sort of stick with you perhaps this year?
I think in humanitarian terms it has to be Somalia and Sudan and the Horn more generally. But I'm talking more humanitarian political rather than humanitarian natural disasters. Then there's the North Africa, Middle East scenario. But we've also been very active in Asia. I mean, Burma is fascinating. Myanmar is interesting at the moment, for example.
Yeah.
But not in scale, but in terms of importance.
In the scale of what you can now do that perhaps you couldn't do in the past.
Absolutely, especially in the dialogue area.
Right. Sara, the main event.
I'm not left with much, but
you can have the same.
well, no, definitely Somalia, and I would say Sudan in particular for me. You know, having worked in the border areas of South Sudan for a long time, the resurgence of the conflict in the so-called Nuba Mountains, today called Southern Kordofan, Blue Nile, is of particular significance, and the fact that we don't talk enough about it is something that bothers me a great deal.
Is that just a British thing that we don't talk about it, or
no,
is there
unfortunately, it's a general
attention?
thing. Very profound lack of attention, which is difficult to understand given the extent of the investment in the independence of Sudan, South Sudan, that the international community has made, and the extent to which the conflict on the border impinges on the viability of the South Sudanese project in its entirety, and of course the suffering of the people involved in the border areas in itself. But perhaps we can talk more about it.
Yeah,
afterwards.
we'll come back to.
But the other one that hasn't been mentioned is Côte d'Ivoire, and that's another one that's been not kind of reported enough, understood enough, analyzed enough, and there is still quite a significant caseload of people in Liberia as well as in camps within Côte d'Ivoire, but also of IDPs, of displaced people there with host communities.
You say that, but there was a statistic I saw recently that said there were 600,000 internally displaced in Côte d'Ivoire, but it had gone down to 16,000.
Yeah, but 160,000 are hosted by relatives. So you see the number in the camps, but there is still a very great deal of displaced that are actually staying with their families. They have not returned to the areas of origins because tensions around land continues, ethnic tensions continue, and there are still 160,000 or 156,000 refugees in Liberia.
Manuel, your year in short.
It will be the same countries in short, but the Horn. But I will add Yemen also as a big issue that is still there and can get worse.
Pakistan, nobody's mentioned Pakistan.
Yeah. Afghanistan.
The floods in Pakistan is also very important. A little bit forgotten.
I keep getting press releases saying you must come to Pakistan. Is it? I mean, how bad is it?
It's not the same as the last flood. It's more focus, and I think it's pretty bad in Singh. And I think we should think that somehow the response has not dealt with the issues on Singh as they should.
Underreported.
Underreported,
definitely.
And what about
and North Korea is another case
North Korea?
Yeah. Of underreported.
But you know more about North Korea than almost any other aid agency, don't you? Because you are a rather important lifeline.
Yes, it's getting better a little bit in the last couple of months. The harvest has been better, but we have 3 million people in real, extremely malnutrition situation.
And are you what keeps them alive? I mean, do you feel that it's quite hard for you, with all these other priorities we've been talking about, to get donors to commit to North Korea?
It's only partially funded, so we focus on the children mainly.
Because you just can't get the money for anything else. And can we talk about perhaps some of the obstacles to doing a good job in some of the places that you've mentioned? I mean, whether that is legislation, whether that is funding. Does anyone want to start on that?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things to say, and I think my friends will agree with me, is that the humanitarian agencies are increasingly in the front line of internal conflicts, which was not the case 20 or 15 years ago. And most of the conflicts today, I think probably all of them, are intrastate. There are virtually no state-to-state conflicts, which means the agencies get in the middle of the front line of the conflict. That's changed the equation enormously. Security is now a major preoccupation for the humanitarian agencies, who have barricaded their offices in many cases.
Can you give us a concrete example of a place this year which where where the difficulty working in the way you describe has been so difficult?
Well, the classic is South Central Somalia, where there's no international staff from any agency based in South Central Somalia because of the Shabab and the fighting there. They only have local staff, and they have limited access with military escorts. So it's a new way of working, a new dimension. I mean, it's not the only obstacle, Jonathan, I'd say, but it's one of them. I think the other one, just quickly, is that, you know, these humanitarian actions in highly politicized situations are a balancing act for governments between political, security, economic interests versus humanitarian. And the political, economic, security trump the humanitarian very often. And when they trump it, the humanitarian is used for the political, a la Libya, in a different way. So I think that equation is lopsided often in many of these intense situations.
Can we talk about Libya, where you basically return to the whole issue of military intervention? In the British case, you had Kosovo, you had Sierra Leone. Then things went a bit pear-shaped with Afghanistan and Iraq. And suddenly a new prime minister trying his hand at it, certainly in this country. Do you look back on that as a success? Has it made your jobs more difficult? How do you see it? Yes, because it's presented here as a success. Gaddafi is gone, end of story. That's often how it's presented.
Thank you, thank you. I actually, first of all, just to say that the part of the question here was it a success? It's hard to measure success on the amount of lives that potentially have been saved. That's really hard to measure, obviously. I think we were all discouraged by not having access to people in Libya during the height of the crisis. But at the same time, we were able to at least get access to people along the borders. So there was some very big humanitarian successes. I think this was a good example of the international community coming together and deciding that they wanted to protect civilians. And so they really took the protection of civilians mandate to the point where they could. And I think this really was taking, you know, the international community together and committing to protect civilians.
Does anyone disagree with that? Because I mean, the whole issue of the responsibility to protect may be seen differently by those who are sort of picking up the pieces on the ground afterwards.
That's one side of the story. The other side is, you know, why Libya, not many other places that, you know, would want to see very similar interventions, perhaps, you know, more rapidly and more robustly. So that is what then polarizes the debate, you know, in many of the countries where we operate, because they see, you know, very decisive, you know, very forceful interventions in, you know, in
and the Tony Blair response would be you intervene where you can.
Well, how do you choose where you can? There may be other places where you can, but you know, if you don't try, you don't know to what extent you can. And could we really, in Afghanistan and in Iraq?
But Tony Blair also called Kosovo a humanitarian war.
Yes.
I mean, that's the biggest oxymoron in humanitarian terms you can have. And you know, this was not a humanitarian war either. It was the Security Council endorsing responsibility to protect and using it politically. The dilemma is you need political endorsement to support protection of civilians. Yep. You don't want political exploitation. And that's what David Reef's article says. You know, RIP for R2P, use the slogan. That's the argument. Be careful how you get it endorsed and be careful what you wish for.
Yeah. Well, and the jury's still out to that extent politically. But I mean, you were, WFP was on the ground in Libya, still is.
Yes, we are still. We are to respond to the humanitarian part of it. Yeah. And you know, on your question, I think the things that constrain us sometimes, funding is not the major issue. I think it's amazing how funding for humanitarian purpose has continued in spite of the crisis. And we think it's...
But don't these Western donors have no choice, given that they're bombing at the same time?
But no, I'm not speaking about Libya in general. But when it comes to things that may prevent us to sometimes to be there where we should. The abuse of the word humanitarian is true. That is something that needs to be very cautious, because everything become humanitarian when something needs to happen because it's more appealing for the public. And that needs to be protected. I think the word humanitarian needs to be protected, not only from governments, but including from the press, actually, from the mass media, because I think there is a certain abuse. What is humanitarian? And I think we need to put it back in the right perspective if we want to be able not to lose access to many of these places. I have been a humanitarian coordinator in the last 15 years, many times, including in Angola. And I think one of the things that permit us to be on negotiating to all sides has been that there was a certain ability that was coming with that title. And I think we lost that. And I think we need to recover that, and it's quite difficult. It's not the only reason. The other reason is that the world has changed, and the type of people we are dealing with is a different type sometimes. You know, when there was the Cold War, and most of the conflicts that were related with the Cold War, there was two sides, indirect, what were behind the parties in conflict. The moment the Cold War has gone, the type of conflicts have a different nature, and that has changed the nature of also negotiations. And I think we need to find a new way of doing. I don't think we are well equipped, and South and Central Somalia is a proof of it. We are not well equipped globally, all of us, to deal with that kind of situation in this moment. And I think we need to find a mechanism where we make a clear distinction about what is humanitarian, and we have negotiators that are accepted for all purpose based on principles, but are.
Are there places, I mean, you talked about places where there hasn't been military intervention. Where are you thinking of? And I'm thinking of Yemen when you say that.
Yeah, I mean, potentially Syria, you know, where there's a similar situation emerging. But, I mean, there's many other places, you know, in Africa, exactly, not mentioning specific countries, where there are similar situations of oppression and, you know, issues around protection of civilians have not been addressed the same way because they're not as important or strategic politically.
But isn't that the way of the world? I mean,
yeah, it is the way of the world. But then, you know, it's when the language is used to justify it, then, you know, you can use the same argument to say, well, you know, sort of call a spade a spade. You know, this is not a humanitarian intervention. It's not humanitarian an intervention used primarily to protect civilians. I mean, there are other interests clearly that motivate action in a country as opposed to others.
Just to say that not all military intervention is R2P and not all R2P is military intervention. And I think that's also another misuse of language in the press at this time. Really, the military intervention is when all other avenues have been exhausted. And I think that there are criteria, and again, it's whether the criteria are applied.
I think, if I may add on that, it's the political selectivity which causes the problem. If, as she says, if the criteria are clear and you apply them systematically, as with the ICC indictment, you can justify it. As soon as there's a political selection process, which there is often, inevitably, then you get criticism of exploitation. And that's the challenge, to try and balance that, or get that balance in the approach. Because we do need military intervention to stop the next Khmer Rouge, for example, obviously, but you know, then it's got to be balanced with other situations.
But if you're an aid agency, do you tend to keep quiet about your concerns because funding comes with intervention? I mean, is that an issue?
I don't think we should. And I believe strongly that we have a moral responsibility as a humanitarian organization to speak up independently of the donors thing. And then I must say, it pays off. If you are sure that you are coming up with the problem is a real problem, then you need to speak up. You have the moral obligation to do that towards the beneficiaries. And I think somehow, in that, if you ask me what probably was our, where maybe we missed the boat in South Central Somalia. I would say that the speaking of that there was a my director to speak off very strongly in April. It was not picked up. And,
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, the humanitarian coordinator, Mark Boden, he spoke of quite often. The problem is that there was no solutions for it. And I think...
well, if you had the money, you couldn't spend it. I mean, that was...
yes.
Yes.
On that part of Somalia, yes, we couldn't.
It feels like the elephant in the room, Somalia. I mean, the Horn of Africa, but Somalia in particular. Just when you think a challenge could not become more complex, it does. We've had the Kenyan army move in. We've had Kenyan policemen killed today at Dadaab. Immensely challenging situation.
Ethiopians going in.
The Ethiopians going in. The Shabab last week banning more aid agencies.
Humanitarian workers have been kidnapped or killed.
Dennis.
Well, it's a bit trite, but I mean, the problem with Somalia at the moment is fundamentally that we don't talk to the Shabab. It's probably the only movement of its kind, extremist movement, where there's not a high-level dialogue.
Do you talk to them?
No. I don't know anybody who talks to them at that level. The agencies talk to them operationally to get access into the territory, but I'm talking about a different level of dialogue. And, you know, unpalatable as it may be, it's going to have to happen. And the sooner the better. A bit like the Taliban.
But why is it going to have to happen? I mean,
because they're part of the equation. They're not going to go away, as the Taliban are not, and you've got to talk to them. And the sooner you do it, the better. But, you know, we've got all sorts of impediments, political, legislation, and emotional impediments to this sort of process.
To put it very, very crudely, if Somalis are not dying on television every night, what is the imperative to talk to them?
Well, because, you know, media spectacular coverage is not the only part of the equation. Many governments are deeply involved, many donors and agencies are deeply involved, people are being kidnapped, etc. So there is a concern. Media is spasmodic. It doesn't have good access either, so it's difficult, clearly. But there's no question that, you know, it's not the only answer or the immediate answer, but there's got to be that process. And the sooner we face that reality, the sooner we can go forward, probably. You can't do it by bombing them, as we're doing in some cases now, and attacking them and sending the military. That won't solve the Shabab problem.
Doesn't the Horn of Africa, and Somalia in particular, throw up in particular the role of the Gulf states? Because, I mean, if anybody's going to talk to Shabab, it's probably going to be them. And the whole role that they play in the humanitarian forum, and other Muslim countries as well.
Sure.
Is that not sort of a major issue now in terms of how that part of the world dovetails with other parts of the world which have been giving for years and years?
Well, some of them have been very active, like Qatar, for example, extremely active in Darfur, as the man we know, also in East Africa, way above their weight. So certainly there have been some initiatives, but it needs more than that. It needs the Western governments also to come to this realization that you're not going to solve this militarily. It's pretty basic, but it continues to be the approach.
But Leslie, what's your response? I mean, you know, it's easy. It's one thing to say you've got to talk to them. You have anti-terrorism legislation. You can't talk to everybody, not openly anyway. You want to help.
We do.
How do you manage that predicament?
Well, we work with very trusted partners. And with our partners, we make every effort to basically ensure that the funding that we provide to them is getting to the people who need it the most. And the way we do that is we have, I guess, a more extreme version of due diligence at this time with our partners. And I'm sure Manuel can contest to that, where we now have to ensure within our arrangements that we have articles in our legal arrangements that ensure that our domestic law will be respected. Now, we do recognize that it does add a burden on our partners, but we do work very closely with them to try and minimize that burden as well. So it's really about the trusted partnerships that we have previously to going in and working in a situation like Somalia.
How fair is it to blame anti-terrorism legislation and this sort of covert war with Shabab for a lack of response, or is that too convenient? I mean, because one could say, well, did the UN's early warning mechanisms fail?
I will say that I don't think it's too fair to say that. You know, we were expelled as WFP by Al-Shabaab from in January this year, from that region. And so I think it's not only that. But I will agree with Dennis that we need to find a way to get the problem solved, to protect the people that is on that region. That is not very large number, and I want to make the record straight, that the number of people in real bad shape in the Horn of Africa is a small number compared with the dimension of the drought. That was much higher than 2000, but much higher than in the last people say 50 years, at least on the last 30 years. I have a doubt about the 50 years. But it was a bad drought. And you don't see people starving or in extremely bad shape in Somalia, in Ethiopia, or in northern Kenya, with the exception of the people coming from that area. There is pockets sometimes coming from central Somalia also. But, and that is quite different. I was the humanitarian coordinator for the one in 2000, not now. And at that time, what we see now, people arriving in Dabad or Adudal, and we see now, we could see all over, inside Somalia and in Ethiopia. We don't see this. And this is the positive thing, is that there was a response. And the national governments also, they were better prepared this time to respond than in the past. But that problem, we were not able to deal with it. Is how we deal with somebody or a warring faction that is not willing, and I think we are putting too much hope on Gulf states. You know, they don't consider them closer than us.
I only mention it because they seem to have the access.
I see. Yes.
Limit.
But I think, Manuel,
I think the solution is actually not in the Gulf states. So could be another country, but not in the Gulf states.
You're going to say which country?
In Eritrea, I think so.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair to say that, you know, while I would never say that the counterterrorism legislation has been the main cause for, you know, a sort of not a lack of response in Somalia, but perhaps a slower response, you know, not as robust as the response as we would have liked to see, it's definitely been a factor in, you know, making some agencies less, I guess, quick at in operating, but not just now in the crisis, even in the last couple of years. You know, just today we were discussing how many organizations were were trying to be more operational in Puntland or in Somaliland rather than, you know, in South Central Somalia, because of course it was much easier to operate. They would not, you know, risk falling foul of the legislation.
Does
there.
anyone plead guilty of sort of displacement activity, of spending money where you can spend it because you can spend it? Not spend it obviously because you can't spend it where you really want to spend it.
I don't think anybody would plead guilty of that, but if you look at where, you know, organizations in the consolidated appeals, in the, you know, that's the mechanism to raise funds in the humanitarian sector, over the last 2 years have been concentrating some of the appeals, you would say that, you know, perhaps there was a lot more requests for areas of Somalia where Al-Shabaab was not operational.
I mean, it's just an interesting fact that the last time I checked, the Disasters Emergency Appeal in the UK, which was hugely successful, given what else is going on in the economy, 28% of the aid was going to Somalia. When I pointed this out in a TV report, there was an enormous fuss, as if I was making out that more of it should have been going, when obviously one is very well aware that it can't. I mean,
Sometimes I can disagree with Sara. I don't think the funding is the issue in Somalia. I think the issue in Somalia is our lack of ability to deal with a warring party that is not willing actually to deal with us. And when I say us, it's not WFP, it's the whole range of partners, including Islamic organizations. And the reason is, maybe is because they also fear that somebody is treating them, and so they are afraid to be exposed. And with the presence that is a truth also, that probably the sense of that, you know, that I'm being encircled, it's very strong. And this the reactions are also unpredictable and and is also the nature of what is behind it, the thinking of this warring force. So it's not an easy situation. That we need to find ways, and I think maybe on the architecture of the humanitarian, international architecture of the humanitarian response, we need to find institutions that may not be even the UN, who are equipped to be able to deal with these kind of situations. And we have one that is ICRC that is, but maybe we need to find a way that is...
Is the ICRC on the list of those organisations banned for last week or not?
No.
So it's still functioning?
So it's MSF, which is very telling, I think.
And the whole ability to scale up when so many agencies are banned, I mean, is that, you know, people like MSF who've been there for years can only go so far in trying to replicate the job of UNICEF, for example?
Well, they have no international presence. It's only nationals.
Yeah.
They can't put internationals in there. That's
Nobody has international.
no international staff. That's the only place where we have no international presence.
And how do you feel about the media coverage of it? I mean, because everyone sort of poured in June, July, made a fuss, probably helped raise money, and it's all gone quiet, it seems.
Yeah, well, you don't have...
You know, let's say the raise of money was for the war.
Yeah.
This is a small piece of it.
Yeah.
So actually, as I say, it's a small piece, but it's the damaging piece. It's where we are seeing people dying, where the risk of people dying still in the next month is very high, of additional people dying. And that is why we should be worried about. Now, we don't have a solution. This is true. As a group, as international community, we don't have a solution for that at this stage. And the dialogue that Dennis mentioned, somehow need to happen, but we need to prepare for the worst in case it doesn't happen.
You know, Jonathan, you have media and film stars going to the Dab, the Somali camp in Kenya. You know, that's easy access and a nice story, but you don't have them really trying to get in as they could do into Somalia. I mean, the Kenyan media are embedded with the Kenyan troops, so they're getting restricted, censored coverage. But there's relatively little coverage of the in-depth problems that we're talking about in Somalia today, partly because it's not safe to go in there and easy to go in there. But there is a need for more sustained coverage. We've said this forever. You know, short-term media stuff doesn't really solve that problem. And then you get the neglected, lingering conflicts. And that's Somalia, that's in a different way Darfur.
I think we should talk about perhaps the relationship between the media and the aid community in our general discussion, but which we shall probably talk for another 5-10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I wondered if you could mention or come up with some thoughts on the forgotten crises of 2011. Sudan, Sara, might be a place to start.
Definitely, I feel very strongly about what's happening in the border areas of Sudan. I've already mentioned it. I mean, just if you look at this weekend, there has been attacks from Sudan onto South Sudan, pretty much around the refugee camp, which the Sudanese government considered as a legitimate military target, but which has created further displacement, and which has seen all the NGOs present in Ida camp in Upper Nile State evacuate, leaving the camp as well. We've seen shelling within the Nuba Mountains in several parts of Nuba Mountains, ground attacks on places like Toroji, and I haven't seen anything in the media. I mean, these are all reports that I get from the ground, from colleagues that are involved, from Sudanese nationals who are, close friends, but absolutely nothing in the media. And yet, there's obviously a lot, victims, not huge numbers, but it's a constant stream, and the potential, of the conflict continuing to escalate is the dry season, and we already see, a full offensive which will continue over the next few months. The destabilizing potential for both Sudan and South Sudan, in terms of how the war can further escalate, and the UNHCR stating last week that the number of refugees in the next couple of weeks could number about 100,000 people. But again, these are just agency reports which are not really picked up in the media.
Is this on your list, Leslie? I mean, is that
Yeah, very much so. And I would say apart from Côte d'Ivoire, which Sarah's already spoken about, Pakistan, which we've mentioned also, I would say the DRC is large on our list. And I would also perhaps take the chance to raise the issue of sexual and gender-based violence, particularly in the DRC, but not limited to the DRC. And that really is, I think, one of the hidden crises, hidden crises that we do not see enough about in the media, and I think it's quite imperative that we see more about that.
If I can just add, even Darfur, which I think continues to be the biggest humanitarian operation in the world, financially, relatively little coverage, actually, although the conflict continues. So you, unfortunately, need the dramatic headline story, as you know, to bring it back.
Well, and also it brings us back to the question of military intervention and those places where you intervene garnering more coverage. I'm thinking of Afghanistan with the Bonn conference today. And we're talking, I saw one figure, £4.5 billion of development assistance a year required. Indefinitely, it seems. Yeah.
Cheaper than the military.
Yeah. I think going back to the media, you know, we used to have media as our main, actually, one of our major supporters when you have a problem. And I remember when I was in Sudan in '92, and we have a big problem, 91, 92. And, you know, we have, because Sudan support the Iraq in the Kuwait war. Everybody cut off Sudan. There was a big crisis. You know, we picked the phone, we called 3 or 4 journalists, say, can you come and see it? We don't say what you're going to report. We just want you to say and see. And actually they come. And we managed to turn around and have a situation where actually there was a response. In Angola was the same. Now we don't have that. Maybe because we lost credibility, or maybe because there are so many other things in the world happening that is a competition for attention, and maybe because people are fed up of looking to that kind of event. But the fact is that we lost that, and that is real bad, because it was one of the biggest issues that could be used to make the public aware. And you know, people on that places, actually, it's not like Cairo or Tunis. They don't tweak so much. They don't, the new social media on these places are very limited. We are talking about in the Blue Nile, on South Kordofan, on it's very limited. So it's something missing, that is the physical presence on these places that is missing a little bit. And I must say that the world, and I want to say that because it's very important, the world is much better today than it used to be. It doesn't look like, but it's much better in spite of that.
So I was going to ask you, I mean, are you optimistic for 2012? I think it's a bit of a contradiction in terms, in the sense of one's obviously dealing with where things go wrong, but looking ahead, where are you concerned about, and how optimistic are you that those situations can be dealt with? Sara.
I mean, I think that, you know, the humanitarian sector has, over the years, as Manuel says, you know, become actually, the situation is better today than it was, you know, 10 or 20 years ago. Generally, in terms of agencies, we become better at, you know, responding to crises. More lives are saved in crisis than they used to. You know, I don't think we should, you know, sort of really always be very negative about the work that we do operationally. But yeah, many challenges remain. The system is still not well set up to respond effectively. There is still, you know, so much to change. I would say, whilst, you know, we shouldn't be complacent about, you know, the advances that have been made, we should also recognize that, you know, when in the height of a crisis, I would say the system responds well. Is when the crisis become more protracted, more cyclical. I think that's where we struggle, to engage properly. And of course, where they're more politicized, that's I think where we fail to act as well as we should.
Leslie, we're talking. Turning briefly to Somalia. The first famine of the 21st century, a scandal which puts phone hacking into a cocked hat. Looking forward. You've sort of, I suppose the aid community, the international community has got that on its conscience, but where are you looking at and thinking this could be next, or where are you worried about, and how optimistic are you?
Well, I'm a serial optimist. The same way I think that Canadians are serial multilateralists. So I'll just put that out there. So I'm already biased in the way I'm going to answer this. So I will probably make a few comments, and you could argue them and say, well, no, that's actually quite negative. Well, I'm taking the very positive side of things. I think we've done some, regardless of the situation in Somalia, malnutrition rates are down. So there have been improvements. And we could have seen much larger death in Ethiopia if safety net programs had not been in place. So there really are some success stories of this year. And whether we want to admit it or not, Libya is also a success story. A lot more people could have been killed than were killed or were affected. The other thing I think that we can see is that a lot of the secondary deaths from many of the disasters we have not seen. So we've started, there are improvements in the system. There's been better speed and rapid response, but we're also seeing a decrease in some of the secondary deaths. I think we've also seen a greater protection focus in the system writ large. Now I'm making my plug for the humanitarian system here, because I think there have been a lot of improvements, but everyone is always ready to criticize and point out only the times that they might have perceived to have missed the ball or missed the boat. And I think there's more thought now to disaster risk reduction, and I think that's one of the pluses of the drought, is that people now who didn't normally think of disaster risk reduction or issues of resilience are now really putting it on, it is getting more front and center. And if I may, I think that the help of the media in these areas is very important to help educate people. And I have one of my I don't want to call it a pet peeve, but I really find the importance of language in media is so important for us to help us as either donors, member states of the UN, to do our jobs better. And whether it's looking at people as victims when they're survivors, and they want to be seen as survivors, not as victims. Looking at people who are displaced in a country and they're not refugees. They are not environmental refugees, but they're people who are really affected by the environment, and they're not economic refugees, but they're people who are affected by the economics of the situation. And also having do no harm images of people out there as well, not always showing the bad side of the story, but there are a lot of good stories to be had out of Africa, and I think it's really imperative that we start also trying to share those stories. Looking ahead, I'm very aware and cognizant of the current economic situation of the world, and I just hope that governments, I know that my government is continuing to commit to trying to help meet the needs of those that are affected by disasters and crises, but I think the forecasts are a little bit, I don't want to say alarming, but certainly there's enough space out there to be nervous as well as optimistic.
Where should we be alarmed about? I mean, where are you thinking?
Well, can I chip in? Excuse me. I was going to say pessimists have a short career in this business. I think it goes with the territory. And just if I may add, Jonathan, I think alarmed at the politicization of humanitarian aid. It's not new. Don't forget we fed the Khmer Rouge and their supporters. We, the West, fed them. As Hammarskjöld, the famous Secretary General, once said, we should be politically celibate, but not necessarily virginal. And I think that goes very much in this case as well. That's the reality of it. Yeah. I think the challenge, geographically we can go through the map, but I think the challenge is, to me, in a couple of key areas. One is, as we discussed a bit today in the meeting, the Western humanitarian system needs to reach out to the South. We need to southernize the Western humanitarian aid approach, because we have major problems because of its Western origin. That's got to happen in a much bigger and more useful way than it's happened so far. And the other thing in this theme of ours is this point that I mentioned. We've got to talk to the untalkable. We've got to talk to those guys who are extremist militants, undesirable, awful people, but they happen to have arms and they happen to be part of the equation. So those sort of measures have to be taken, and we've got to keep, if we can, political support for humanitarian action without being politically exploited. Those are the major challenges, I'd say, thematically on the horizon.
I'll tend to agree with a lot of what Dennis said. I'll say that I'm afraid that in spite of the world being better today than when I was young, I have no doubt about that. You know, I want to tell one story. In '79, there was a refugee camp in my country that was razed to ground, 3,000 deaths. Was no news. That can happen now anymore. And I could go on with another story. But what I'm afraid, adding to Dennis, is just the number of people that may fall down from the edge with what is happening with the increased number of weather-related disasters may be massively. The level of population growth in some areas of the world, and particular in the Sahel area, where there is a contradiction between resources and needs, may lead to massive displacements in the next 5 years.
That's another issue that's fallen off the media agenda, climate change.
No, I don't think so. I think media has been still covering a little.
Not
but
this year.
Look, compare the media attention in Copenhagen to Durban, it's quite different.
It's not just climate change, it's land grabs as well, and nobody really, talks about, but it's actually, especially in Africa, the amount of land that's being leased to others without the consensus of the communities, I think is a bit of a time bomb as well. And I mean, I see that more sort of at a closer range in Sudan. It's something which is not being talked about, and a lot of leases are being, sort of signed off, and it hasn't had an impact because the community have not seen,
It'll be
the
on Channel
investors.
4 News next week.
Oh, good. I'm pleased to hear that, but that is definitely something.
If it is, I just want to say one thing, Sara. I agree that we need to be very worried about foreign land grab in Africa, but I tell you, the main land grab in Africa is done by the nationals and by the elites in the different countries, and that is what is more worrying, 10 times more than the foreign one. And if you look in Rio, the lack that there is no private property rights for the communities is a way to land grab. And that is an issue, that ownership of land in Africa that is not being dealt with and is a taboo. Needs to be talked about. But that is not so
Well,
much
I think we'll end it there.
opinion.
We've covered an enormous range of subjects. There are lots of things we've left out. Accountability, aid diversion, tricky subjects. If anyone's read the recent book by MSF on going back over various emergencies and looking at Sri Lanka, for example, and the awkward, more than awkward accommodations that have to be made in difficult situations. I'm going to throw the debate open to the floor. If you do come from an organisation, please state your affiliation, and do feel free to ask anything you like of either any individual panellist or the whole panel. Any questions? Yes, gentleman right.
Thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former British Customs officer and essentially independent now. And my work is more on developmental rather than humanitarian, but I've worked in countries where they do cross over. And my question is essentially based on some rather negative experiences with the World Bank when I was in Yemen, where in 2008 and 9, when the problem was the really almost total impossibility, without being thrown out, of raising with the World Bank that they had to look across the board at their projects there and with others, because the visibly obvious deteriorating security situation was going to have an effect on a lot of other things. So I think there's a challenge there in coordinating responses and contingency plans, which leads on to the question about perhaps giving the Somalia or indeed other examples. And it is is the one that's really having to try and square the circle in south central Somalia. Why is it that Shabab will not talk? And secondly, before the expulsions, what contingency planning was being done across the board, within organisations and across the board, particularly following the USAID famine early warning system, putting the red lights up, which I think was about November last year. And I know that's not a full question because it still doesn't raise the answer of how on earth you get in when people don't want you in and are going to fire back at you if you try to get in. Thank you.
Huge question. I mean, where do we start?
Why won't they talk?
Why won't they talk? I mean, obviously there was a decision last week to expel more groups.
Yeah.
So one might ask what the spur for that was as well.
Well, you don't know until you talk to them. You know, I think we were told the Khmer Rouge wouldn't talk. We were told the Taliban wouldn't talk. I mean, we were told they weren't structured. It's not true. They're all structured. They've all got mechanisms. And if they want to have a share of power, which the Shabab presumably do, they will talk eventually. They have to, if they want to be part of a government. If they want to be Joe Coney and LRA and just spoilers, then they haven't got an incentive. But these movements have got an incentive, and I think it's the way you approach it.
Leslie, how do you see it? I mean, why do you think they're not talking? And the second half of the question seemed to be, was there a failure to prepare for this?
That's for Manuel.
Yeah, I would have to defer to my colleague from WFP on the second one, and on the first one, I can't answer beyond what Dennis has said. Really, I'm
guessing.
Yeah.
I mean, Manuel, you did say quite strenuously that the problem was that they wouldn't let aid agencies in. But the second half of the question was quite clear. Was there a failure to prepare?
I think there was contingency planning done, and there was, and very high, but probably could have been better prepared, in my opinion. So we need to accept that. I don't think on our for the bad it was pretty okay. The response was quick. I think on where our contingency plan probably didn't work perfectly is more in the Ethiopian border, in my opinion. That there was big gaps in the beginning, and there are still some gaps there. So there was a problem at that stage also that we are cut from funding.
You're talking about the Americans here?
No, globally. No, there was no. I'm not speaking about only the Americans. No, global. But that I don't think is the main reason why we couldn't be faster. So, and I need to say that we should have been able to even to be better on the response than we were. I think we catch up very quickly, but I think we should. And it was more also a problem of bringing all together. I think there was a problem of how we coordinate the whole thing in globally.
Just to add, maybe donors were responding to the WFP appeals and the other partners' appeals. However, it was not reported in the media. I mean, donors are currently in the 35 forgotten crises every day, whether it's reported or not in the news, but it just doesn't get the recognition.
But the UN was underfunded, no question, before the announcement of famine in June.
Yeah.
Correct, but the UN is always underfunded in every.
But I think it's fair to say that the early warning was very clear and it was timely. Yeah. The situation in Somalia was very well documented and analyzed by the various FuseNets, FSAU, the various early warning sort of analysis organizations that we have in the Horn. There is undoubtedly been an impact of the counterterrorism legislation on some of the, the slowness that there has been in the response. We can't deny that. I mean, the agencies have been screaming about it. Those who they continue to be operational, in national
I heard that the US Treasury had to get a different set of lawyers.
Well, there was a relaxation of, the OFAC. which is the Office for Assets Control, in August, which was July, August, yes, beginning of August, I think it was. It was not completely clear, and actually, agencies continue to be very, very hesitant because they were not clear about, to what extent the regulations had been relaxed and what it meant, whether, this was just for the immediate term, but could have implications for the long term. There was a lot of nervousness within the agencies on the ground. That's only fair to say, because actually it has been.
Can I add one thing?
Let me just say one thing before Dennis. When it came to WFP itself, as you were not there in Central and South at that stage, actually this was not the reason.
You were,
why
you were expelled last January, not this January, 2010.
Yeah. So we were not there and we couldn't be. But I think when I say that we could be faster, I was on putting together as a group of support on the food response. That we did it between June and September was done, but it should have been even shorter than that, and that we need to set it.
But just to add one thing, if I may, we mustn't forget also the responsibility of the host states here. Ethiopia and Kenyan governments knew it was coming, had resources available, or could have had resources available, and should have been part of it. It's very easy to look at the agency's response. We mustn't forget. Somalia is a bit different, but those host states will...
Imagine 400,000 people on the White Cliffs of Dover. I mean, the Kenyans had a problem.
Oh no, that Dadaab camp is a different story. That's been taken care of.
That colours the whole thing, doesn't it? It colours the Kenyan response.
That wasn't the main crisis, sir. The Dadaab camp wasn't the main food crisis. It was inside the countries. And those governments did not respond in any responsible way, as before.
Shall we take another question? Yes, this gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Tom Hardy-Forsyth. I just recently retired as Senior Advisor to the Kurdistan Regional Government on capacity building. I want to pick up on a point that you made about this idea of a new architecture, the possibility of a new architecture for international application of aid and intervention. I remember back in the days in Iraq when, as an example, we started the Oil for Food program. And what happened there was, as you know, Saddam instituted the Anfal campaign to destroy the agrarian infrastructure. The Oil for Food program actually completed what he'd started off by turning all these people into dependents by dumping unwanted wheat from countries I won't mention on these places, instead of giving them the seeds and the means to re-establish their ability to grow their own crops. So this is an example of political imperatives and economic imperatives overcasting the real humanitarian needs. If you're a donor at the moment, you're also a customer. The real customer is not the recipient, and that of course is different from business. If you're creating Mars bars, the intelligent customer, if he doesn't like what you create, he doesn't buy your Mars bars. We've got the situation where the recipient is disenfranchised mainly because the donors are the real customers. So being optimistic, remembering there never used to be a United Nations before it existed, there never used to be an international court before it existed, is it actually possible? Can we get started in creating an architecture with rules and laws under international law for where the money, the aid, the type of aid is applied almost altruistically? A difficult question. And it's not a rhetorical one. I really think that we ought to work for that.
I think you should start with that. You are largely held responsible with transforming the WFP, are you not? From entirely, if you like, an aid dependency culture to more of a...
Food assistance, yeah. I must say, there is a big transformation in the last years. WFP buy most of its food from the countries where we operate. We don't buy from the international markets. And this was possible because most of our donors as permit us to do that, and that's actually incentivated even us to do some of them. And this has changed completely the ball game. And as you know, when you buy locally, we support the local economies, and this permits Rio to have a synergy there that is very important, and even to support small farmers. But still, we need to understand that in certain circumstances, buy locally is not possible, and you still need to go and buy on the region or in the next place, and this still happens. I give you the example of the floods in Pakistan, where we bought most of the wheat we provide in the farmer areas of Pakistan, supporting the farmers there actually, and permitting people affected to eat the wheat that was produced in Pakistan. This actually put the economy running. So that is possible in the last years, and today is normal, actually.
Leslie, I mean, how do you feel about that? Do you feel under pressure to? I mean, you must have competing pressures, but you know, one pressure which says we don't want to create an aid-dependent culture, and another pressure which says, well, if we're going to spend our money, we should spend it on Canadian suppliers who stand to benefit.
That's a really good question, and I think we have to acknowledge that there has been a lot of progress in the world of the way the donors provide assistance. For instance, in 2008, Canada fully untied its food aid budget, so that in fact none of the purchase of the food aid or the cash that we provide to WFP or to the Canadian Food Grains Bank in Canada, none of that is tied to purchasing back in Canada at all. And there is a move for the DAC donors, a lot of commitments by 2012, 2013 for Canada to fully untie all of its overseas development assistance. So I think we have to acknowledge and recognize that there are a lot of small changes that are going to have huge impacts in the system. I don't think we're going to see the cataclysmic new architecture change, but there have been a lot of really important changes. You know, if you think of the coherence panel and the results that has had through the UN system, if you think of the humanitarian reform back in 2005, there's been some very important steps as well. And I think if you look at the way donors have tried to continue to coordinate amongst themselves, the way that the UN system and the agencies have tried to coordinate amongst themselves, well, not a perfect world. I think we all agree that we want to work with what we have, make it better, as opposed to, well, we have a habit of never getting rid of anything before we create new things. So I think we really are of the approach that let's make what we have work, because the reality is if it didn't exist, we'd actually create it anyways.
I mean, just perhaps to say the obvious, you know, these institutions are state established and state funded, and states aren't humanitarian. States are political and security and economic and a bit humanitarian. So, you know, we shouldn't be too surprised when the balance is not on the humanitarian side, and that's why I don't think there's much mileage in trying to reform and re-establish, because states in the end will decide the framework, and states in the end will fund it and implement it. And that's the reality we live with. We just try and work it in the best possible way, as you said, rather than rebuilding it.
When I speak about the need to create something, is not in general. What I say is for the situations that we are living now, where we have non-state actors that don't talk with any institution that is linked with states. That is the case in Southern Somalia. We need to have a mechanism to deal with that, and is a must for the sake of the people who will be in these kind of areas, and that may be much larger numbers in the future than we think.
Another question, yes, this lady.
I support an organisation, the Hunger Project, which works in the way you are talking about, which empowers grassroots people, but works with governments and all levels of society. It's not so as well known as it needs to be. It's been pioneering this strategy for some years, and it's getting very powerful now. Another thing I'd like to say is that a new book has come out called The Responsibility to Protect. Do you know about that? Mm-hmm. You do. Is it a good book?
No.
Pardon?
No.
Dennis says it isn't.
It isn't. Okay.
Don't tell Gareth Evans.
But the main...
It's been streamed online, Gareth will hear that.
He's online. Sorry, Gareth.
Just wave to him.
Sorry, Australia.
But the main thing I want to talk about is a situation that involves very few people, not the numbers you are talking about, but it is enormously important and crucial at this time. It involves 3,400 people in Iraq, Iranian refugees, which are an inspiration for a large, educated, effective Iranian opposition in exile. And Iran is doing everything it can to destroy this community. It has threatened to close down the camp. It's the making of a massacre.
Can we turn this into a question for the panel?
And do you know, first of all, do you know about this? And it needs urgent attention.
Anybody?
Yes, we know about it. It needs urgent attention. It's probably getting more attention per capita than any similar situation in the world today. It's got a huge lobby in the US and in Europe. And there's a real question about the history of this group. We are aware of it.
Right. Gentleman at the back's been trying to ask a question for a while.
My name is Guido Ambrosio. I work for UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees. Certainly many issues have been invoked. It's hard to know where to start. But first of all, on Somalia, certainly the wrong characterization is that this is a natural disaster. You throw a little bit more money at it, and then the problem will be solved, as has been eloquently...
I don't think anyone was saying that, though. I mean, making quite clear it was a man-made disaster.
But certainly, as Manuel said, there is a difference between what's happening inside Somalia and then what is happening in Kenya and Ethiopia. And certainly it is very complex and very difficult. Contingency planning and response has been mentioned. Certainly this year has tested the limits of some big agencies. It started with Côte d'Ivoire and the whole Côte d'Ivoire, Liberia. Then it went immediately towards Libya and the neighboring countries. Then the Horn of Africa, and right now also exodus from Blue Nile State in Sudan towards Ethiopia. Let me mention, by the way, that a country like Ethiopia, as we speak, is now facing three simultaneous influxes: one from Somalia, one from Eritrea, and another one from Sudan. And contingency planning, I've seen many, but very few that were on the mark. It's very hard to predict what is going to happen in the future. And let me also say that certainly there are many forgotten crises. It doesn't necessarily mean that the media should cover every one of these forgotten crises, but for example, there are I don't know exact the numbers, but tens of thousands of Rohingya Muslim Burmese in Bangladesh who have no prospect of returning to their home.
Well, I mean the list is endless, and we can. And you have dealt with the ones we can.
But one other thing that has not been mentioned is that about the Libya crisis is that you had. As a byproduct, so to speak, of this crisis, you have tens of thousands of people who were expelled from or had to flee Libya. You had a joint operation between UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration. You had a huge humanitarian evacuation.
Yes, which I was there. I reported on that. So that did get attention.
But as we speak, there are still about 6,000 refugees, this time not migrants, who are stranded at the border in Tunisia and at the border in Egypt. And one thing that the European countries have not done is to increase the resettlement opportunities for these people, because the governments of Tunisia and Egypt, rightly or wrongly, said that these people are just temporarily admitted on their territory and pending, but they all have to go somewhere else. But unfortunately, we have not seen an increase in resettlement slots.
If you don't mind, I'm going to move on because we've only got the room for another 15 minutes or so. This lady on the left here.
Should ask a question, shouldn't we?
Yes, if you can ask a question, please. That would be
I'll try and be quick. I'm not from no particular organisation. I just have a question to the panel. It's going back to Somalia, but it's more the theme which Mr. De Silva and is it Dennis spoke about. Firstly, with the cooperation you're talking about with the humanitarian organisations, are you saying that is there still a humanitarian organisation functioning in Somalia at the moment? Did you say the Red Cross was, or is there one at all there?
in South Central Somalia, which is the main.
Do they have
national staff?
Do they have communications with the Shabab right now? My question really is: one is, does it have to be a political discussion, or can it be from the organisation itself? And secondly, if that's impossible, can you, as Mr. De Silva was talking about, through a mechanism, divert funds via the organisation that does have communications with them?
It's ICRC in the audience. We could ask them directly.
I mean, there are sort of the unsung heroes of that crisis are the Somali NGOs who have not been banned and who other organisations work through. But I think, yes, the ICRC is a different, a unique case, perhaps.
Well, no, Jonathan.
There are several.
International organisations have national staff in South Central. Somalis.
Yeah.
They have. That's not just Somali organisations.
No.
So the UN agencies have national staff.
But
and
not now. I mean, if we're talking about last week, I mean, the ICRC are the only people who haven't.
As well, and a few Islamic NGOs, some. Yeah,
there are quite a few.
There's still
there are a few.
There are a few.
And can I just say the point is that they do. We've had a discussion with them recently on this. Those organisations who are there, and some of them are international with national staff, have arranged with Shabab locally for delivery in those cases, with the local arrangements. What is missing? What I was trying to say was missing is the higher level contact with the Shabab Shura, as it were.
And would that be political or through?
Could be humanitarian. It could be political.
David Cameron has called a big conference on Somalia for next year. The UK has decided to play some sort of leadership role. Will Shabab be at that conference? I don't think so. Yes, this gentleman here.
It's Nicholas Meller, Independent. Mr. De Silva just mentioned, well, there's a lot of discussion about the importance of the media and how much exposure was coming from the different places and from whom. Mr. De Silva mentioned the social media, and which leads into the kind of informal media, which is obviously a chance for the diaspora and other non-institutional actors to have much greater voice. Looking back on this year, how significant has that been? And looking forward next year, how important could it be? And is it an opportunity of looking at things in a different way?
So the role of social media, I don't know whether you've written on that, published on that?
No, we haven't published on that, but we have gone digital this year for the first time as HPG to reach out, to some of the humanitarian workers that do use social media. But we have been sort of again tuning into the use of social media as an area, to understand better in terms of the response and in terms of accountability as well, in terms of getting the feedback from the the beneficiaries, from the recipients of assistance around, first of all, whether assistance has been well targeted, whether it has been received at all, sort of positive and negative impact of this assistance and so forth. And that's actually something in Somalia has been happening quite a lot, because partly as a result of the difficulty of being present in areas of South Central, this has been one way to get around it, to use digital communication, mobile communication a lot more, to get some feedback. But as Manuel was saying before, you can use that everywhere. There are areas, particularly urban areas, perhaps, where there is a mobile connection, where that is possible. But there are many other sort of crisis areas where this is not a useful tool, because communities continue to be cut off from this kind of technology.
Manuel, are there crises you wouldn't have known about if it wasn't for social media?
No, I think social media is actually a huge opportunity to develop accountability to the beneficiaries of our operations. And actually we are putting on even in the Bad camp, we have a mechanism for people to tweet or to get in touch with that, because they are part of these regions, of these areas that actual people can use. Actually Somalia has been, as you know, the Somalis have a lot of imagination and ability to innovation. And so actually is one country where social media can be extremely useful for making our operations more effective. So it's something that can improve accountability of all of us, what is a very important thing, in my opinion. So I still say that in some areas of the world, this is not there yet.
Aware of that.
And we need to remember that even where there is no tweaking, there are people. And so, and people are very important, in my opinion. And particularly those who cannot communicate are very important, because they normally are those who are subject to abuse more.
Can I just make a quick comment on that?
Yeah.
I'm not from my personal experience or my government's experience, but very much from the partners we work with. There's been comments on the use of social media, again on the accountability side of things, that has allowed people to actually look at the objectives set by the partner or the humanitarian agency or the development agency on the ground, and whether they've actually met the results. So it's really, you know, to look at ambition and reality and whether they're married up in the end. And so I just wanted also to make one more comment. You spoke of the unspoken heroes, and I did want to mention of the diaspora and the remittances that they send back to Somalia, and that's something that is very hard to tabulate, but it's also something that's really worthwhile mentioning, because it's something that we will never be able to measure the impact, but I think if the remittances were ever to stop, we would certainly see
They've gone down, haven't they?
Impact.
I mean, I don't know if that's apocryphal, but they have gone down.
Another question? Yes, lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Sandrine from Médecins Sans Frontières. So we are also analysing, of course, events and looking to the future. And one of the things that we're going to be working on next year is really looking at the aid system. And my question is to the panel, whoever wants to answer it. Our analysis is that the aid system is not fit for purpose. And in particular, the very early stages of emergency response, our operations are reporting to us that, you know, there's no one on the ground. And that we have a few hypotheses about that. One is about rejection of humanitarian aid by certain states and certain non-state actors. Another hypothesis about new actors on the ground that we may not know about. Another hypothesis is about the working through local partners has meant that actually there isn't this kind of immediate response anymore. So I just wanted to hear from the panel, you know, what your thoughts are.
So the system not being fit for purpose and not being prepared.
Can I say a word on that?
Yes, Dennis, you start.
You know, just very generally, I would take issue with that. I think the aid system, the assistance system, has improved enormously. Remember, 50,000 people from Rwanda died in those camps in Congo in '94 from cholera. We have not had that repeated in any of the emergency situations since. That's a bit extreme example, but I would suggest that the humanitarian relief aid system has improved enormously to avoid that sort of. What is not fit for purpose, in my opinion, is the protection system. It's the protection of civilians, not from famine and disease, but from abuse and attacks and violence. That's the weak link, I would suggest, in the system. And that's really way behind what it should be, I would say.
And who would have responsibility for that?
Well, it's mixed. Peacekeeping missions have it, and every peacekeeping mission is a protection of civilians mandate now. UNHCR has it for refugees. UNICEF have it for children. The Office of Human Rights have it in human rights terms. None of those are doing at the maximum what could be done, and partly I would I would also suggest states are not pushing them this priority. They push the priority of aid. They don't, with great respect to a lot of states represented here, they don't push the priority of protection in these frontline situations very often, and they don't work properly. Congo continues to be sexual violence without proper redress. You know, abuse of that nature, I think, is a real failing, I would suggest.
System is not fit for purpose.
Maybe I'm optimist.
Must
but
be MSF.
Maybe I'm optimist, but I have no doubt about the improvement of the response systems. We can respond much quicker, much in larger scale than ever. I think even in protection, there was a lot of progress. is still probably not there, but it's a lot of progress. What I don't think we have one solution is for in active conflict where we need to negotiate. What is the mechanism to do it? And I must say, it's not enough. We need a system that addresses the global issue. We don't need a system that addresses 5 village problems, because that it's fine. It's a good thing to do, but it's not enough. So, and I don't think that any system that is connected with states can address that issue. And I think we really need to have something that on a situation that we're living can be activated and can be in charge of having ability to negotiate in a way that is a little bit perceived and is looked by all actors involved, or all different kind of actors involved, as a real neutral body.
How theoretical is that?
Yeah.
Can I just quickly just follow up on that one? Because you made that point twice now. How theoretical is it? I mean, you're head of policy for the WFP. Is anyone really talking about an organisation which talks to non-state actors, the Taliban, the Shabab, or whoever?
That has the ability to do without being constrained.
Some do already. Some organisations do. There are organisations that do that.
But I think Manuel's talking about
something bigger.
No, what I'm saying that you need to have a kind of responsibility to do it, not only when they want or not.
I just wanted to say 3 quick points to our MSF colleague. I find gross generalizations quite dangerous, and I just wanted to come back on the fact that no one is on the ground. Well, I think if we looked at all the first responders who are your neighbors and the local Red Cross networks, I think they might take issue with that comment. But I also understand it's the wider question. And on that, I do think that we do have continued need for improvement within the humanitarian system, the UN system, in the area of coordination and the area of leadership. And I think all will admit to that. And then perhaps the third thing, I'll take issue with what Dennis said, or perhaps clarify on the issue of protection. I understand what you're saying from the perspective of peacekeeping missions. However, I would also note that whenever there has been any protection activities in a humanitarian appeal, they happen to be the most fully funded because the donors actually want to fund protection, and it's just because it is such a challenging...
Is Haiti a case in point for you in Canada? I mean,
Haiti is a case in point. We were quite challenged, though, that the protection cluster took quite a while to get up and going in Haiti. So there were a whole range of protection issues that were not being addressed at the outset. And of course, the Haiti example is a very challenging example for so many reasons. It was beyond beyond the scope and magnitude of what we'd seen, and also with the UN being affected as well, and many of...
But it was predictable.
It was predictable?
The earthquake?
No, I mean the aftermath. The violence. Protecting civilians.
Yes, that's
right. Lady at the back.
Thank you very much. Sara Collinson from the Overseas Development Institute. I have a question mainly for Dennis, actually, and it's about your comment towards the beginning of the discussion about how the international humanitarian system needs to southernize. And my question is really, isn't the international system already southernizing by default to a large extent, to the extent that many international staff are not willing or able to put themselves in harm's way to the same extent as national staff? And that Somalia is not the only country where the bulk of implementation is carried out by national and local staff. And so what would a southernized international system look like that's different from the system that we have today?
Well, I think it's a bit unfair to the international staff who live in non-family hardship stations, whether it's Kabul or parts of Africa. I think that's a bit of a harsh comment. But I take the point. I think my point was rather partnerships. I think the Western humanitarian aid thing has got to look more southern in some parts of the world. In Sudan, for example, they're de-internationalizing South Kordofan. The internationals will not be allowed in because they said we won't have another Darfur. So, you know, we've got to be careful, I think, to try and work with willing and competent partners in the South much more on the ground. I don't think it's just because of national staff. I think I'm talking really institutionally. There's a partnership, I think, that could be explored.
Jonathan, if I can add, it's also, there's a growing movement of humanitarian actors originating from the south, some of which also operate in different countries. Interesting in Southeast Asia, there's a movement of so-called SINGOs, southern-based international NGOs, and these are, Malaysian, Indonesian, Chinese NGOs that provide assistance, across the borders when a disaster, particularly natural disasters in that region, strikes. And those are the kind of changes in the system that we have, the Western sort of side of the humanitarian system has not understood enough and linked up enough, and interacting, at an equal level. And I think if we don't engage more seriously with the emerging, well, I won't even call them emerging, the well-established actors in many contexts, will become progressively irrelevant in many of the contexts in which we operate.
Understood. Yes, over here.
Hello, my name is Eloise Riodel. I work for the Refugee Study Centre in the University of Oxford. One thing so obvious that we have actually haven't mentioned it is around weapons and the proliferation of weapons in many countries. We've talked about it's probably more difficult to buy food than buy a gun. So I would like some reactions from the panel on that, on how can we change that. I mean, in terms of, we talked about armed groups. I mean, in many contexts, those guys are, we take their gun and we give them another one, and they move from being in an armed group to being in an army, the regular army. I mean, Congo is an obvious example.
Is this a question about what the current DFID buzzword, which is stabilisation, and aid being tied to security?
That could be a good one. And if I may give a little how do you say in English? A pitch. The Refugee Study Centre just issued a policy brief called "Stabilizing the Congo," where we address the issue, which stabilization has been presented in a very technical manner, whereas it's a political issue as well as a humanitarian issue. So some reaction.
Well, it's accounting for an increasingly large part of the DFID budget in terms of perhaps the less obvious NGOs who are doing that kind of work. Any thoughts, Sara? You must have found yourself.
We've done quite a lot of work on stabilization, within HPG, and I think the biggest problem is that when you advance stabilization objectives, you have so many different objectives come together, which are not necessarily aligned or coherent, but rather in contradiction with one another. So it's a framework that brings together political objectives, state building objectives, humanitarian objectives, development objectives, you name it, and sort of making sure that they can be implemented coherently and effectively is almost impossible. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges around the stabilization debate, is actually stabilization frameworks and approaches have not really proven very successful on the ground. There is a lot of rhetoric around them, but it's very difficult to mention stabilization efforts in many of the countries in which there's been a significant investment in stabilization.
Is that because it's harder to measure? I mean, a bag of food is a bag of food, but unless you measure guns going off and on the streets.
But
stabilization is a complex issue. It's not about only guns, it's about the whole society. And
that'll change.
For people mistake themselves when they think that a country that went through 20 or 30 years of war, that the moral tissue of the society has been destroyed, family values has been affected, can rebuild in 2 or 3 years of peacekeeping. That is a big mistake. This can only happen if there is a unification in the society towards peace, and then needs intervention at all levels. And one of them is to get a proper police force, and eventually even small armed force to prevent others to prevent stabilization, but proper one, well trained, well paid, well served, and taking away all other arms from the society. And that also is a very complex issue. There's too many arms. I think we need to have a kind of regulation, at least, where arms are being sold all over the world by the way, they don't come from that countries, most of them.
Yes, Dennis.
Just on the arms thing, it's an obvious point, but this is the nature of governments. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, which mandate peacekeeping missions and pay most of it, are the 5 biggest arms suppliers in the world. So, that's the nature of governments, and that's fundamental. It's a very easy way to pull back on peacekeeping, is to reduce arms sales by the Security Council members. Pretty basic, but it's not happening.
Any thoughts on that? I mean,
we're not.
They're not one of
them. Like you.
Good to have a Canadian view on arms sales.
I won't comment on arms sales. I mean, I think there's some obviously things like I could say, but I would just say more that there is a tendency towards stabilization units, and that is a fact. And I think it's imperative that we continue to work and put renewed energy into making sure humanitarian principles are respected within the stabilization component.
With guns.
Can I just make a comment also? Operating on these environments is very complex, and I think sometimes people don't really give the due to the people who are doing this job. We lost, as WFP in Somalia, 8 people in the last years. We lost 58 people in the last 10 years. 1/3 international staff. So 2/3 were national staff. I think that it's very important that people understand that operating in these areas also is accounting for all things. It's quite complex. There's a lot that must be done. Also, because if you don't account, then we don't know where it goes, and there's dangers even for the people itself. So we need to be accountable, and we need to. But it's extremely complex. I think many times we took too many risks on this, and actually, people are trying to be less risk taker than in the past. And this is a dangerous situation. I tell you honestly. Look, on the Indian Ocean, where there is all navies trying to prevent piracy, piracy is still ongoing, and there's it's an open ocean with a lot of radars and things to trace all these things, and still it's not easy. Imagine what it's to follow on humanitarian, not food. Food is one, actually, is probably easier to follow than other things. In the middle of IDP camp in 20 kilometers out of Mogadishu. And I'm not trying to defend anything. I must say I have nothing to defend. I'm too old for that. But I'm just saying we need to respect these people who are working there. Most of these people work on these operations. They do it because they really think that it's important to save lives. They really think that is a kind of, they are rewarded by the lives they save. And I tell you, to see that is extremely damaging sometimes what you see. The worst thing in the world I've seen in my life, and many people have seen, is people dying of hunger. And this is what drew me to this business actually, was to try to prevent. And I don't complain. I think we have prevented a lot of people to die. And it's worthwhile to see. But we need to respect these people who are there. They are people who really take risks, who damage their families, who have a right of divorce that nobody has, who don't see the kids for a long time, and sometimes also they lose their lives. So I really think it's very important that these people are respected, and so I ask everybody to have this in mind when they comment. Without reduction, without taking away any accountability of what they do. That should be there also.
Sobering thought.
What about the status of women? Where the status of women is lowest, hunger is worse. That's been shown. Are you doing any work with women? The status of women?
To what extent have things changed and become more women focus?
I think everybody is much more aware along these years, you know. Since the time I was young to now, that there is a total different. I'm very optimistic again about the state of women's improvements. But abuse and gender-based violence in these areas where there is no protection is still something that we should be highly concerned on. So I join my word with Lester on this.
Just to say that we make a point of holding our partners very accountable, ensuring that there's gender equality not only within their organizations but within all of their operations. So you see they all pointed to me because they've seen me in their boards, you know, raising the issue of gender equality again and again. And there's a number of member states that do this, and it's a bit of a coalition of the like-minded who continue to make sure that through all operations and where they can, the issue of women's rights or ensuring that women are recognized the way they need to be, it happens. For instance, WFP once upon a time did not give the food ration to the female in the family, but now they make sure the woman or the female in the family gets the food ration. I mean, there's a number of very important changes that have occurred in the minds of the humanitarian community.
If that fact doesn't put in risk the protection of the women.
One
but
challenge,
what is exception?
One challenge we have is to get women at the table with governments and non-state actors. In peace processes. They're not there in many of these discussions. Yeah. We have to insist on it.
There were two in the Burundi peace talks, two women.
Yeah, and we asked and they bring token representation, but it's a real challenge if we want to get that gender balance into the process.
It's not only the gender balance, it's that women are more for peace than men in general.
Well, that's why they should.
Quite frankly, that is how many women you have on the mediation team or negotiating team from the UN or some of the member states that mediate.
As well.
It's not just on the other side.
That is correct also.
How are we doing? We've run over our time, actually. Do you mind if I wrap it there? I'd very much like to thank our guests for sharing their expertise with us this evening. Leslie, Dennis, Manuel, Sara, thank you very much for coming. I think we will be around for a bit of time afterwards if there are issues you want to raise that you didn't get the chance to raise. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.